You stand in a room that smells of paper and rust. The light here is thin, a weary beam seeping through a barred window, catching the dust in slow, lazy spirals. The walls press in with the weight of decades, lined with rows of steel cabinets that have not been opened in years. The air is close, almost damp, carrying the faint, sour tang of mildew and something older, harder to name. Your hand moves along the cold fronts of the drawers, fingertips grazing over tarnished handles and fading labels. Most are easy to open. One is not. The metal feels warped, the edges dented as if someone once tried to force it shut. You pull once, nothing. Again. This time it moves with a low metallic groan, the sound of something that has been disturbed after far too long. Inside is not the neat order you expect, but a confusion of files stacked at odd angles, their corners curled, their ink bleeding into the paper. You shift a few aside and find it. An oversized envelope lying at the back, its surface yellowed and fragile to the touch. Across its face, in block red letters, one word: private. The stamp has bled into the fibers over the years, the color sinking deep like an old injury that never healed. You lift it carefully. It feels heavier than paper should, as if carrying more than what is inside. The flap opens with the faint crackle of glue giving way. No typed reports, no case histories, only a single sheet, thick and coarse, hand-drawn in black ink. It is a family diagram, crude, uneven, the branches stretching downward from a single name at the top. Half of the names are underlined neatly in black. The others, exactly half, are circled in crimson. The red is faded now, the lines trembling slightly as though drawn by a hand that did not want to shake. There is no title, no key, no explanation for the marks, only the uneasy certainty that this was not random. Someone made a decision here. Someone drew a boundary that split a family in two. You cannot yet tell if the circles mean the chosen or the doomed. The map has no legend, but it told a story no one wanted to read aloud. Before we unfold this forgotten map, tell me, have you ever heard a story so strange it felt impossible? Share your thoughts, and if you're new here in Echoes of Time, tap subscribe so you don't miss the histories that were almost lost. The paper in your hands names them. At the top of the crude diagram, Donald Galvin and Mimi Galvin. The black ink is steady here, written with the kind of formality reserved for a title. Their faces appear in parish newsletters of the time. Donald in a crisp military uniform, shoulders squared, jaw unshaken. Mimi in tailored dresses and pearls, her smile composed, the image of mid-century Catholic respectability. They lived in Colorado Springs, in a house that seemed built to be photographed. The front lawn was trimmed so evenly it looked ironed. The driveway was swept clean, the pale brick of the split level gleaming under the sun. It was the 1950s American ideal. A devout Catholic family, 10 sons and 2 daughters, all presented without flaw. Donald had returned from the Pacific Theater a decorated man. He had served in the final, brutal months of the war, where heat and gunpowder hung in the air like a second skin. Official records list commendations, but not the nights he woke in silence, his breath sharp, his eyes fixed on some point that wasn't there. No one spoke of such things in those days. What he carried home was never named, but it shadowed him, threading itself through his long pauses, his withdrawal into work, the way he measured his words. Mimi's path had been a different kind of surrender. She had once dreamed of life in New York, of galleries, theater, and light spilling through the high windows of the city. But marriage to a military man meant movement, and movement finally ended in the smaller world of Colorado Springs. Here she built her kingdom inside the walls of their home. She turned ambition inward, into the ironed folds of linen, the polished grain of wood, the rigid choreography of family life. Discipline was not simply encouraged. It was the framework that held everything in place. Each child was dressed to a standard, hair parted precisely, shoes polished to mirror back the light. Meals were set with perfect symmetry, even on ordinary days. Affection was measured, praise scarce, correction swift but controlled. And then there was the falconry, a hobby that seemed at first merely unusual. Donald introduced it to the children as sport, as skill, a lesson in patience, precision, respect for strength. But it was more than that. Leather gloves, hoods for the birds, the slow tightening of tethers. You learn that a bird will sit calmly when blinded, that it will wait when its movements are bound. Control dressed as care. Neighbors admired the order, the symmetry of the lawn, the quiet at night, the children in matching suits and dresses for Sunday Mass. But inside, the rules were not just guidelines. They were boundaries that could not be crossed. What the neighbors saw as order, the children learned as silence. If you've ever lived in a place where silence spoke louder than words, where order hid more than it revealed, share it below. And if you're drawn to the truths history tried to keep quiet, join us here in Echoes of Time so the silence doesn't win. Donald Jr. was the first branch on the tree. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the same deliberate posture as his father, he seemed built for leadership. Teachers described him as focused, capable, a boy who could guide a team without raising his voice. On the football field and wrestling mat, he carried himself with precision, his strength matched by an almost military discipline. To those who watched from the stands, he was proof of his parents' methods, a model son in a house built on order. But the fractures began in silence. At first, it was the stillness. He would sit at the edge of the dining table long after the plates had been cleared, eyes fixed on something no one else could see, the muscles in his jaw unmoving. Minutes would pass, then an hour. A sister might pass through the room, the scrape of her shoes against the tile breaking the quiet, but Don Jr. would not turn his head. Then came the disappearances. He would leave the house after breakfast without his school bag, without a word. Sometimes he would be gone until evening, arriving home with damp cuffs and mud on his shoes, his expression unreadable. When asked where he had been, his answers were vague, just walking, just thinking. No one pressed further. There were acts that unsettled even in their simplicity. One winter afternoon, without hesitation, he walked down to the frozen edge of a reservoir, stepped into the water fully clothed, and kept walking until the ice groaned beneath him. He stayed there, water rising past his waist, until a friend on the bank shouted his name and he turned back as if waking from a dream. Another day, his mother found the family's largest photo album on the living room floor. Every image inside had been altered, each face, carefully and cleanly cut out, leaving only the bodies, the settings, the empty shapes where people had once been. Not a scrap of paper was left behind, as though the missing faces had been carried away and hidden. In the Galvin home, these things were not spoken of in front of outsiders. To his parents, they were quirks, signs of pressure, perhaps an early weariness from the responsibilities of being the eldest. He was told to focus on his studies, to keep busy, to push through. The break came one night without warning. It was past midnight when a driver on a highway outside the city saw a figure walking along the center line. Donald Jr. was barefoot, his shirt half-buttoned, his gaze fixed upward. When the driver slowed and called out to him, Don Jr. pointed at the sky and said the moon had been following him for hours, matching his steps, waiting for him to stop. That night marked the first time anyone outside the family would see the depth of his unraveling. It would not be the last. If you think someone close to you might be showing early signs of a hidden illness, would you act? Or would you wait? Tell me in the comments, and if you value stories that make you think twice, subscribe to Echoes of Time now. It did not stop with the eldest. Once the first fracture appeared, the others began to follow. Sometimes slowly, sometimes as if something in them had been waiting for permission to break. 6 brothers, each carrying the same shadow, but each wearing it differently. One swore that the walls of the house moved while he slept. He said that the hallway outside his bedroom narrowed at night, that doors shifted a few inches to the left, that the kitchen window sometimes opened onto nothing but black. At first, he only spoke of it in whispers to his younger siblings. Then he began leaving chalk marks along the baseboards, convinced they would reveal the night's changes by morning. Another abandoned his schoolwork and turned instead to the insides of clocks. Mantel clocks, alarm clocks, wristwatches, anything that kept time. He dismantled them piece by piece on the kitchen table, the gears laid out in precise lines, his fingers tracing the shapes like someone learning a new language. He told his mother time was broken, that he had to see where it had cracked before it could be repaired. None of the clocks were ever put back together. In the basement, a third covered the walls in strange murals, sprawling shapes and symbols, eyes that stared without blinking, lines of words in no language anyone recognized. They would appear overnight, layered and jagged, and then, without a word, he would paint over them with white before anyone could study them too closely. It was as if the images were messages he could not allow to survive. One simply vanished. He left the house one afternoon without a coat, without money, without explanation. The family searched the neighborhood. The police were called, but there was no trace. He returned 3 days later, shoes caked in mud, eyes sunburned from long hours outside. When asked where he had been, he said only that he had followed the sound until it stopped. No one ever learned what that meant. Another turned inward, moving through the house like a ghost, his footsteps barely audible. Weeks would pass without him speaking more than a few words. He would sit for hours in a chair facing the corner of the room, unmoving even when called to meals. His breathing was shallow, his face empty of expression, as though the body remained but the person had stepped away. The last of them could not contain what was inside. His illness burned hot, flaring into sudden storms of violence, shouting at voices no one else could hear, shoving furniture against doors, shattering windows with his bare hands. He would be calm minutes later, unaware of the blood on his knuckles. They were bound by the same family, the same walls, perhaps the same blueprint written before birth. Yet to the doctors who saw them, and to the family who lived beside them, each case seemed a different language, familiar only in fragments. No single diagnosis could explain why the walls seemed to close in for one, why time collapsed for another, why silence hollowed out the rest. If you had watched this pattern unfold, one by one, would you have seen the connection, or believed they were each a separate tragedy? Share your thoughts, and if you want to follow the paths history tried to scatter, subscribe to Echoes of Time so we can walk them together. For the two youngest, the house was never a home. Margaret and Lindsay learned its layout not as rooms and corridors, but as a map of danger. Some hallways were safe when the doors along them stayed closed. Others became gauntlets, narrow stretches where a sudden movement, a shadow under a door, could turn the air sharp with threat. They learned to listen before they stepped, to pause at corners, to measure the silence. When the storms came, doors slamming, shouts breaking through the walls, they ran for the places that could hold them. If the master bedroom was too far, they hid in closets, knees pulled to their chests, breath held until their ribs ached. In the dark, they counted the seconds between noises, trying to guess how long it would take for the danger to pass. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. Margaret kept a small box under her bed. Inside were objects only she understood. A hair ribbon, a smooth stone from the yard, a flashlight no bigger than her hand. It was her safe box, things she could grab if she had to run without warning. She never explained it to anyone. She didn't have to. Lindsay, younger, had no such collection. She lived in the constant readiness of flight, always aware of the nearest exit, always listening for the faintest change in the air. She spoke little, watched much, and carried that vigilance into every place she would live after. The cost was not in bruises. It was in the wiring of their minds. They grew into women who did not trust quiet rooms, who measured safety in seconds, who could not stand with their backs to a door. Hypervigilance became habit. Detachment became shield. The word safe was never something they believed, only something other people said. If you're still watching right now, you're already more of a witness than most people ever were for these sisters. Don't just watch. Subscribe to Echoes of Time so these voices aren't forgotten again. Over time, the house reshaped itself. It no longer functioned as a family home. It adapted to contain what could not be cured. Bedroom windows were nailed shut from the inside, sealing out both escape and intrusion. Certain doors had locks on both sides, so that no one could be certain whether they were keeping danger out or trapping it within. One hallway was stripped bare after the frames that once lined it were shattered too many times to replace. The glass had embedded itself in the carpet, in the walls, even in the wooden baseboards. splinters of memory scattered until nothing was left to break. Police began arriving without sirens, their headlights off as they rolled to the curb. Neighbors rarely noticed or pretended not to. The officers knew the house well. They moved quietly inside, their voices low, their steps careful, as though sound alone might ignite another storm. By day, the lawns remained flawless, edged with a precision that drew compliments from passers-by. The shutters were straight, the brickwork clean. To anyone standing on the sidewalk, it was a model of stability. A place where the grass was greener, the family larger, the life better. But inside, it was crisis management without pause. A rotation of locked doors, shattered objects, and the constant tension of waiting for the next fracture. It was a place that had learned how to hide its own truth. Would you have noticed the difference standing on that perfect lawn? Or would you have believed the facade? Share your thoughts, and if you want to see past the wall's history built to hide its darkest rooms, subscribe to Echoes of Time. For brothers were never circled in red. They moved through the same rooms, heard the same sounds in the night, but the illness did not take them. To the outside world they were spared. Inside, they were the watchers, living each day with the knowledge that the line between them and the others was no thicker than ink on paper. One kept journals stacked in neat towers beside his bed, not of events but of himself. Each page recorded his hours of sleep, the meals he ate, the sharpness of his thoughts, the rise and fall of his moods. He treated it like maintenance on fragile machinery. If he caught the smallest change, perhaps he could prevent the rest. Another disappeared in a different way. He left Colorado altogether, moving so far that the mountains became memory. He filed papers, changed his name, and built a life where no one could trace him back to the house. His absence was permanent, a kind of survival by erasure. One took to the sea. He bought passage on long voyages, crewed on ships that stayed away from land for weeks at a time. In the rhythm of waves and the endless horizon, he found a place where the shadow could not catch him, at least not easily. He spoke little of his family, but he never stayed ashore long enough for their gravity to pull him back. They were the ones who remained on the edge of the map, never certain whether the illness had passed them by or was only waiting. If you had a 1 in 2 chance of inheriting a mind-altering illness, would you want to know? Tell me below, and if you've made it this far into Echoes of Time, you're part of a rare few. Join us fully by subscribing. In the 1980s, a team of researchers arrived at the house with needles and vials. It was not a diagnosis they promised, nor a cure. They called it a study, nothing more. Blood was drawn from each sibling who would agree, labeled, and sealed away for reasons the family was never fully told. There was talk of patterns, of science looking for clues in the smallest parts of a person. But once the vials left, there was no word of them again. For decades, the samples lay frozen in storage, suspended in silence like the house they came from. It was only in the modern age, when sequencing could read the human blueprint letter by letter, that the blood was touched again. Scientists mapped every line of code and found something repeated in all of them. A variation in the SHANK2 gene. It was not a simple answer. The mutation was present in every tested sibling, those who had fallen, and those who had not. A constant across the family, but not a constant in its effect. It was, as one researcher described it, a key without a door. You could hold it, you could measure it, but you could not say where it fit. Theories gathered in the gaps. Perhaps the key only turned if something else pushed it. A strain before birth, an infection at the wrong moment, a collision with another hidden fault in the code. Perhaps it was waiting for a signal no one had yet identified. In the data, the mutation was just another sequence of letters. In the lives of the Galvin family, it was a quiet, enduring possibility, one that could lie dormant forever or wake without warning. If science found that same key in your own blood, would you want to know it was there? Tell me in the comments, and if you believe some truths should never be left buried, subscribe to Echoes of Time. The years thinned the family, one name at a time. Some were claimed by illness long before their bodies failed. Others endured for decades, their days measured not in progress, but in the careful management of what could not be undone. Institutions became permanent addresses, rooms with bolted beds, calendars where the seasons passed without meaning. The ones who survived outside did so scattered, some cutting away their ties completely, others carrying the weight in silence. Deaths came quietly, without public notice. The obituaries spoke in simple terms, omitting the shadows that had followed them all their lives. When their parents were gone, Lindsay returned to close what could be closed. She walked the rooms one last time, noting the repairs, the fresh paint, the new fixtures. But under it all, she said, the house was still a building with two faces. One it showed the street, and one it had kept for itself. The property changed hands. Walls were knocked down, floors replaced, gardens replanted. Yet the foundation remained exactly where it had always been, holding the same ground, the same weight. And so the question lingers, as stubborn and unmovable as that foundation. Was it chance? Was it fate? Or was it a blueprint written before birth? If the answer could be known, would you want to hear it? Share your thoughts, and if you believe the past should be faced no matter how dark, subscribe to Echoes of Time so we can keep asking. Some families pass down silverware, letters, or land. The Galvins passed down a sharper inheritance, brilliance that could light a room, and breaking points that could shatter it. It was not wrapped in ribbon or stored in boxes. It was carried in the blood, in the unseen patterns that shaped their fates. And now you know the truth behind the map. You can see it again as it was in the beginning, crude lines drawn in black, half the names ringed in crimson. At first, the marks were only a mystery, a code without meaning. But now every circle has a face. Every face has a story. You have walked through their rooms, heard the weight of their silences, stood in the spaces where their walls once closed in. The map was not just a record. It was a prophecy. And like most prophecies, it was only fully understood once it had already come to pass. You've now seen the map. You've heard the names. In Echoes of Time, we open these doors knowing they may never truly close again. If you think stories like this matter, subscribe now. And if you don't, tell me why in the comments, because silence was the one thing that nearly buried this history forever.